Commissioner Sykes may be joining as well.
Awesome.
So Dr. Brooks, while we're getting ready, we have some guests on the call today who are master's students at Notre Dame in policy. So I talked to them earlier that if they have some, like, if we don't have a lot of public comment, if they just have some process or policy questions for you, I hope maybe we can open up the floor to that.
Sure.
If,
and they can
if
also
that works for you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot in public. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I think if we have time, for sure, I would love to talk about that. And then also if folks would just like to, reach out via email, I'm more than willing to talk, as well about sort of policy and all that jazz. So that's really, really great.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. I need help. that is me, the student. All right. Actually, Miss Martha, I'm doing PhD in leadership. So.
Oh, there you go. There you go. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to undervalue your work.
No. It's okay. I'm used to everything, so I'm just gonna be quiet, sit down, and be a good student. All right.
There you go.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right.
So, what do we have? What?
I believe first up is a policy KCA.
Are we all here, Christian, or are we just Miss Ronald? Or I can't see.
We're just missing Commissioner McFadden.
Awesome. Okay, so like just a minute, because it looks like it's just turned 3:31, and then sort of I'll call the meeting into order. And Christian, do you know if we have any students joining us from ASCBC?
Unfortunately, no, because they have a conflicting meeting. But that's why I also let you know that Commissioner Sykes may be joining on their behalf.
Okay.
They have a conflicting meeting at the same time, unfortunately.
I see.
Although I don't know if the engagement office is if they're expecting any students, but I know as far as the ASCBC and ASCBC is if he's able to join, Commissioner Sykes will be representing them.
Awesome. Okay, great.
Chief High Hubbard. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yep.
Chief High Hubbard, are you in the building, or did you just paint your house to match the board office because you
matches
so
the
much?
Board office?
Sorry, Commissioner Brooks.
Yeah. That's great. That's wonderful. All right. So how about we get started? So I'll call this policy committee meeting to order. It is now 3:32 p.m. on February 16th, 2011. And our first policy up is policy KCA, which will be about family and community engagement. And so I will pass the mic to that team. And so I just want to also flag before we get started that if we could sort of keep the presentation to about 20 minutes, then we can sort of have time for a robust discussion. And welcome Commissioner McFadden as well.
So good afternoon, everybody. I just want to introduce Jessica Lawrence, who is the policy specialist from the Family and Community Engagement team. She has been doing a tremendous amount of work on this policy. We're very pleased to bring it to you today. I should have introduced myself. Hi, I'm Tina Highcovered, Chief of Communications, Engagement, and Enrollment. Sorry, I did not do that. We're very excited to bring this to you today. I do want to just flag one thing, that we have done a tremendous amount of engagement prior to this conversation. And once the first reader, you all have seen it, we're going to take the first reader out to many more people to get them to see the draft of it, because we wanted to make sure that the board saw it, et cetera. But we are going to continue our engagement throughout this entire process. So you will see a glimpse of what we've done so far and then what we plan to do moving forward. And I will be here for the entire meeting, helping with Chris Dory represent Allison because she's not able to join us today. So I am in that capacity as well. And with that, Jessica, I will turn it over to you to get started. The fabulous Jessica Lawrence.
Thank you, Chief Highcovered. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started so we can stay to time and answer some questions. So our agenda for this update is to review some of the major updates to policy KCA, share updates and progress on stakeholder engagement and feedback, and then communicate our next steps for this stage in the process. And so at a very high level, the revisions in the policy around the purpose really call out that only when there is family and community engagement combined with high quality classroom instruction that our students are able to reach their full potential. And that is what is anchoring our policy today in the revisions, just recognizing the important role that our families have and what we do every day to educate our young people. Again, we recognize that this is a new way of thinking and it requires a shift in mindset. And so it means that we see family and community engagement as not separate from what we do for instruction and teaching and learning, but more of an essential component to effective teaching and learning. And we also recognize that stakeholders and staff need the opportunity to be able to develop the knowledge and skills and capacity to engage in effective partnerships that yield student success. And so in order to do so, we have to build the capacity of our staff and stakeholders at every level to be able to move the work. Some of the standards also include that we are recognizing stakeholders and staff as partners in decisions that affect children and families and how we work together to inform, influence, and create policies, practices, and programs. We also recognize that effective family and school community collaboration assures that all stakeholders have key opportunities and strategic opportunities to collaborate and work together to make decisions in our schools that improve academic performance for all students. And then also, we're calling out that we recognize the board's goal that through this policy, it helps us to create the environments by which stakeholders and staff are invited and welcome to be engaged stakeholders in their school communities. And then lastly, we recognize the importance of making sure that we have data to drive our work, and that could be through our parent survey, our family and community engagement self-assessment. Those are some of the important updates that were made to the policy standards. Important key terms that are included in the policy that were not there previously based on feedback. That is our community and neighborhood engagement, as well as our partners, calling out family engagement, which is a separate and important body of work in family and community engagement because it links those practices that we lead with families, those strategies to academic achievement. And then defining family-school partnerships, making that plain to folks so that they have a clear understanding of what that looks like. And then other key terms that we call out in the policy that are new, youth and students. We have a youth engagement call to action, and we want that reflected in our policy. We're also calling out the importance of defining youth and adult partnerships to anchor the work that we're leading to ensure that our students have voice. And then school community, defining that as school staff, students, families, community partners in our neighborhoods. And I'll quickly give an overview of some of the major revisions in the policy. Of course, aligning the FCE strategies and implementation goals and everything that we do throughout each school year to the equity policy. Establishing a common definition of family and community engagement. This portion in the policy is in progress because we're not done with our feedback. And so we don't want to include that definition until we feel like we've heard from as many stakeholders as we could possibly hear from to make sure that we get that definition right. I mentioned earlier integrating youth voice throughout the district and engaging youth as meaningful partners in the educational process, elevating the voices and experiences of stakeholders and staff and school level decision making through school family councils, building the capacity of all stakeholders. That includes our families, staff, at every level in the organization so that folks can get on the same page and have the confidence to partner with families. And then also creating the conditions to sustain partnerships that link to student achievement and school improvement. Supporting open, transparent, and effective two-way communication through language access for our EL families. And then leveraging partnerships and community engagement to support school improvement. And so in detail, I'd like to talk about some of the major components that you'll see in the recommended implementation strategies. And so that's relaunching and branding our school, family, and community councils. And I just said the name without saying that. They were formerly known as school family councils, but we are restructuring those and working with BTU and Baltimore City PTA, PCAB, and CCAC to get an understanding of what decision making has to look like in schools, and making sure that that decision making body is reflective of all stakeholders and staff. And then monitoring and tracking decision making at the school level. This is extremely important. We've heard direct feedback from staff, families, and partners that there has to be a way to better communicate what this looks like, and making it accessible to all on our website. And then the data-driven family engagement, leveraging all of our data to improve practices and family experiences, making sure that from that information, the engagement office is going in to provide targeted coaching and PD for all stakeholders, not just our staff, but our families on how to make meaning of that FCE data. And then two-way communication. Really important to be responsive to some of the feedback that we've learned about making sure that we're improving our communication strategies and tactics. And so we like to be able to make sure that we're jointly developing what that looks like every school year with stakeholders and in community with families. And then also providing technical assistance and training to schools on best practices for communicating at the school level. Youth voice and engagement. Again, this is new. It was not previously reflected in the policy. So one of the things that we're working to do, this work is not finished. It's still in progress through the work group for school family councils, but we're elevating youth voice and decision making through school family councils, which are now known as school family and community councils. And what that looks like is requiring school teams in middle and high schools to have at least 2 youth representatives, and making sure that schools have the capacity and knowledge to reach out to non-traditional voices and youth leaders in schools. And then also developing the capacity of our staff to be able to do that. Professional learning and training, I mentioned earlier, this is anchoring most of the policy, making sure that each component, along with its implementation, has robust training and professional development, not only for staff, but for our parents and families. And then we've also heard from families in our feedback sessions that they need to know how to navigate this district and understand academic milestones. And so in that work, the engagement office will be partnering with district office teams and other content offices to make sure that we're effectively communicating and building capacity around that. Community engagement and partnerships, making sure that we're providing regular opportunities for two-way communication and information sharing with our partners. Tracking and monitoring partnerships and volunteers through the PI portal, and then also providing ongoing training and guidance on how to align those partnerships to school level priorities and needs. This is the last slide for the key components, and language access and multilingual engagement is extremely important in the policy revisions, and that making sure that language access and technical assistance and training for schools is available, strengthening multilingual family engagement in our ESOL sites, and also sites that don't have that designation, but they have a growing population, and also making sure that our targeted supports really make sure that our families feel welcome in the educational process and reflect their needs. School level supports, designating a school level point of contact in every school around youth engagement, partnerships, and volunteers, and then making sure that all of our FCE planning and implementation strategies are captured in one place. And so this is extremely important. We've heard from families that I don't know that I'm in a Title I school, or I'm not sure what the community school strategy means. What is the action plan? What is the family engagement plan? I didn't know about the homeschool compact. And so through this one plan, which is a school, family, and community partnership plan, it will serve as an all-access resource to make sure that families understand what those items are and how they link to supporting their families and their students. It'll be in one centralized place, kind of like streamlining everything. We're still figuring out what this looks like in the regulations, but it's important to come out and share that this is direct feedback that we've heard from not only our families, but our staff. How do all of the different components in the engagement office work? And how does it talk to all of the things that schools have to do for instruction, making sure that family and community engagement is part of that work? And then there's some key components to the regulations. Again, detailed guidance and expectations for decision-making and advocacy at the school level for all stakeholder groups, rebranding the school, family, and community councils, adopting the dual capacity building framework for family school partnerships to guide the implementation of this policy, and district level strategies for this work, authorizing the creation of that one catch-all plan, that one place for families to be able to access information and resources about rights and responsibilities, and then outlining school level and district level responsibilities for professional development around family and community engagement, details about how we strengthen two-way communication and supporting language access for parents and families, and targeting outreach and support for our EL families and LGBTQ youth and families. And so lastly, monitoring and tracking the effectiveness of this policy and our implementation strategies through a family and community engagement rubric and assessment tool. And I'd like to talk a little bit about, by stakeholder groups, some of the engagement that has already taken place for parents and families. We've done surveys, one-to-one interviews, focus groups, virtual stories, and information sessions. With our parent advocacy groups, we've touched CCAC, PCAB, our immigrant and newcomer family connectors, Baltimore City PTA. We are working hard to get feedback from staff and individuals in schools that are responsible for family and community engagement. There are roughly about 400 of those folks that work across our schools, whether they are parent leaders, volunteer leads, FCE liaisons, community schools coordinators, and other individuals that help to strengthen family and community engagement in schools. And so we're touching those individuals. I mentioned the work that we have through the School Family Council work group, where we're rebranding that and updating the regulations to be reflective of all stakeholders. And I'll also mention here that we are connecting with our charter schools and operators to get their feedback. And then our community-based organizations, we've touched the Baltimore Climate Collaborative, which is representative of over 200 partner organizations, our partner advisory group, which is led in partnership with Baltimore's Promise, our City Schools Community Advisory Group that consists of faith-based organizations. We're getting ready to collaborate with Baltimore Ceasefire and the Center for Urban Families. And then for youth, there's been a lot of engagement done in that area in terms of surveys, town halls, focus group discussions, and there is more work that is going to take place for stakeholder groups. And I'll just quickly add some of the important next steps that we have in place are sharing the first reader with stakeholders and staff via the district's website, social media, school-based teams, and partner pages. Launching our FCE advisory group to begin planning and making sure that we're able to start the work of implementation, planning for the revised policy, joining PCAB's monthly parent forums. That's something that we do every month to provide an update. And this is just a snapshot of some of the groups that we are working to get feedback from and connect with: faith-based, the Mayor's Office of Children and Families, district office staff, our school-based teams, community schools lead agencies, grassroots organizations, multilingual parent and family advocacy groups, and we will share those updates in terms of numbers and when we've touched those groups with the board as soon as that information becomes available. So I think I kept it at 16 minutes. So we have a little time. Commissioner Brooks, thank you for that guidance.
Jess, can I add one
Sure.
last note, which I want to make sure folks know that we are trying to make sure that we are thoughtful about implementation of the policy as well. And so I just want to bring home that while this is the policy, we can't expect that everything as soon as it's passed is going to be the new way of we do things, right? So Jessica's also committed to doing a fully developed implementation plan along with the policy, so we know how we're going to actually carry it out. Sort of similar with the equity policy when that was passed, and then you saw the year rollout of what that policy looked like and how we actually change behavior and practice in schools and at the district level. I want to make sure I highlight that as well.
Thank you. And that's part of the work for the rubric and how we monitor our effectiveness. So yes.
Commissioner Brooks, you're on mute, sir.
Mm-hmm.
You're still muted, my friend.
Muted.
Well, and now you look frozen. Are we good? So
he's moving.
Okay, so Commissioner Brooks, give me a thumbs up if it is okay for me to ask a 10,000-foot question to start us off. All right, thank you. Chief High Hubbard, just a kind of roll back to when we first did this community schools policy and whatnot. When we first approved the community schools policy, our goal was in 5 to 10 years to have all schools be community schools. Could you sort of, and it's fun because policy is like 500 feet. I want to go like up to 1,000. Where are we with that? Is that still a goal? Have we decided that all schools actually don't need to be community schools? Where are we on that? And then I have underneath that questions once Commissioner Brooks can get his mic on.
Yep. So it's a great question. I make sure we tie that this is the family community engagement policy, and there is a separate community schools policy. We do reference the community schools policy in this because they're so linked close together, right? But in terms of the community schools policy overall, we are now, I believe, at 134 schools out of the 170 schools are actually community schools. That is because of the concentrations of poverty grant that was given by the state last year, where we ramped up very quickly from 50 schools to 100 and whatever, and then we added some additional schools this year. And I believe the number right now is 134. The passage of the continuation of those funds with Kerwin and that kind of thing, it's actually built into that every year we increase the bandwidth at which we judge how a school gets, because right now the highest poverty schools are the ones that get community schools coordinators, right? And so that percentage is going to widen so that eventually by that legislation, all schools will actually become community schools funded by that state initiative. So we're well on our way of growing the strategy, and we're really proud of the lift that took place in 2 years to get that many people hired, trained, action plans developed, implementation plans developed. It's been a lot of work, but they've also been the staff that have shown up the most, in my opinion, through this pandemic in person, right? Through managing the meal sites and food deliveries at home and bringing laptops and home internet, that kind of thing. And our partners, the lead agencies, have also been fabulous. So they're excited to grow it. We're excited to grow it. This is probably too much information right now, but I will just say that this summer we'll be doing a full new launch where people can apply to be lead agencies, or that people can switch back to district. We did a 2-year strategy. So we'll be having that. Just a minute, baby. Okay. That's the reality.
Yep.
And we're trying to create a way where we're very transparent and clear about how a lead agency can be a sponsor of a community school, or if a school wants to stay with the district sponsored ones, they can do as well. But they all get the same joint training. They all get the same outline expectations that we're doing. So but to your question, it's closely linked to this policy because the community schools coordinators are an intimate part of what the family and community engagement strategy is.
Perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to highlight that for the public mostly.
Yep.
So thank you. Commissioner Brooks, I think you're back in, right? Yes. Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay.
And I think everyone can. It's not about me.
Great. Great. Sorry. So my Teams might do this again. So it froze and I couldn't unmute myself. So if it does, I'll just log out and log back in. Thank you, Commissioner James, for jumping in with your question. So we can sort of go to the next commissioner with any questions. So Commissioner McFadden, do you have a question?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I don't necessarily mention it. Number one, before I go to that, the makeup of the school family community council, I'm glad that you all outlined that and the types of people that can be involved on that particular group. So I appreciate that. But I have a question about I think it is in the regulation draft. I believe we are in Roman numeral 4, implementation strategies, the things that you were just talking about. And I know that this is important to you, Chief High Covered. But as you are developing it, I would like to see the rubric. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And when we'll have the rubric? And when the policy is adopted, will the rubric also have been created to attach itself to a regulation? I know that it could be something that is ongoing development, like it will be, I don't know. So just can you explain a little bit more about the rubric? Because, and I'm asking that because in that same section, Roman numeral 4, letter B, where it talks about implementation strategies, and it is B, and I believe it's number 7, city schools will monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of SFC councils. So I know that the rubric is attached to that monitoring, but for accountability's sake, I know that the policy is the foundation and we move over time. But can you just talk a little bit about that, please?
Yep, I will start. Then I'm going to ask Jessica to come on. Come on, camera, Jessica, you're on. But what I will say is we're doing a whole bunch of work right now with the School Family Council revamp. We brought in BTU, we've brought in parents, we brought in PCAB. We have a bunch of folks helping us think through how we revamp that. So that's just an integral part of what we're doing. But Jessica's the one designing the rubrics. I'm going to have Jessica go ahead and talk about that for a moment, please, Jess.
Thank you, Chief. So in terms of the rubric, as Chief High Covered mentioned earlier, we've been getting feedback and planning for this policy for quite some time. This work started before the pandemic. And what we did collaboratively as a division with some of our partners, where we looked at the dual capacity building framework, which is a compass for how we move our work. And we looked at the existing policy and we pulled out the implementation strategies. And based on research and based on standards for family and community engagement, what we did was we put them into sections and we said to the team, what does success look like? What does success look like if these are fully operational, if there's a fully operational school family council? What would that look like? How would families, frame out, this is where I see myself in decision making, I'm able to give input. And so in terms of the rubric, what does it look like? It is a set of goals and best practices for each of the implementation strategies. So I'll start there. In terms of the school, family, and community councils, it would be making sure that at the baseline, making sure that schools are hosting meetings and they're broadly communicating them, and making sure that they have best practices and standards and models for what that looks like. Will you be able to see a copy of the rubric or a draft? Absolutely. We hope to have that ready by the second reader, or if not sooner. We're collaborating with OAA. We met with them last week to tell them about get their input to make sure it was aligned to some of the things that we are looking for and asking in the end of year parent survey and our FCE assessment tool. And I think we shared that with the board at our last meeting. Does that give you a sense, Commissioner McFadden, of, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'll just add one quick thing, Jess, that the board, when policies are being developed, we have committed to make sure we have a way in which we're measuring the implementation of the policy written into the policy. And so this is our attempt at making sure that we are being thoughtful and deliberate about making sure we are evaluating the effectiveness of our policy revisions.
I appreciate that. So once the rubric is in draft and ready for us to see, I would love to see that. And hopefully prior to us adopting the policy, I think it would be important for us to also have that included in the regulation. So I appreciate that. Also, when you mentioned, making sure that these councils are meeting, in that same section of Roman numeral 4 in the policy, section, maybe this is a different section. So now we're in, yes, implementation, Roman numeral 4, section B, letter B. It goes to number 5. At least once every year, each school must hold a public meeting at a reasonable time to which all of its stakeholders shall be invited to. So if we're trying to make sure that schools are actually meeting and engaging the community, why is it, what's the thought behind just that 1 year public meeting versus maybe biannually or quarterly?
So I can speak to that. So the annual meeting actually comes out of the requirements for the Every Student Succeeds Act, and that is Section 1116, which provides school districts across the country with guidance and regulations for how Title I parents and families should be involved. In 2009, when this policy was adopted, there was a decision that this is a best practice for all schools. And in that annual meeting, it's the one time that your entire school community, your partners, your parents and families and stakeholders come together to find out about the school's priorities and plans and supports for academic achievement. That is traditionally known as the back to school night. And so that should be happening at the top of the year in every school in a way that families can come and find out everything that they need to know to be able to partner up with that school community to support their child's learning. And so that is known as the Title I annual meeting. We've made it a requirement for all schools. But I think if you look in the other section of the policy, I think it's the capacity building, there is a section where we call out that every school should be regularly providing opportunities for stakeholders, particularly parents and families, to build their capacity. So that one meeting is like the baseline because it covers the Title I requirement, but there's a section in the policy that calls out schools should be regularly providing opportunities above and beyond school family councils, above and beyond the annual meeting to engage their families ongoing.
And Jess, I'm just wondering when we did the draft work around this, we know that there's the annual budget meeting that has to happen as well at schools. And I'm wondering if we just acknowledge that there's at least 2 meetings that happen every year, both the introduction to the school year as well as the budget meeting in this section, because it is a requirement, right, that they have to have the budget public meeting with the stakeholders in the community, the families, et cetera. So I was just wondering, we should think about that, Jess.
No, I think it would be great. I think you're spot on, Chief. What we haven't been able to share yet is the revised regulations for school family councils that we're working with BTU and PCAB and other folks to produce. Some of that language is in there in terms of drilling down to what budget engagement looks like and how stakeholders should be regularly informed and engaged in those opportunities. Yes.
I appreciate that and the thought behind it. I'm still processing that. So I appreciate the thinking because I know that this is in draft. And then finally, Dr. Brooks, in the regulation, when we look at the makeup of the school family councils, and Ms. Lawrence, I appreciate the addition of students, making sure that there are students there. Specifically from the way that I've read, it is really just for the secondary level students. So the middle school and high school students. I do not think that it should be optional for our elementary school students to be involved in that way, especially as we want to build a continuum of leadership and student voice and value that I think earlier on, if we're able to help guide and navigate our young people through leadership experiences and opportunities, I think it will, just build that continuum, better build student leaders who are prepared to advocate for themselves and for their peers and ultimately for their communities. So that is my personal preference with having elementary school students. I think that they should be included on those councils. I think it would increase parental involvement also by having those students involved. So that's my take on it. Thank you, Dr. Brooks, and I know that there are other hands.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for that feedback.
I think that's an easy pivot, Jessica. We can certainly include like 4th and 5th graders at the elementary level to participate. I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah, and Chief, maybe what we can do, because this came up in our planning with Sally, what we can do is we can maybe build out regulations that include best practices for engaging our young learners in a way that it speaks to them and is relevant to them to get their feedback. That's something that we could easily incorporate into the regulations. Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. And so I saw Chair Chinia's hand, and then we'll come over to you, Commissioner James.
Thank you. Michael, it's not so much a question as just interest in terms of this one plan, the school family
and community
partnership plan,
yeah.
Right. It's a great idea. It's huge. And so I really would like to just hear a little bit more in terms of the thought, because in trying to put, I know you want to try to put everything in one place for folks, but the variety of programs and plans and requirements that different schools have, what format will this plan be in? And will there be the opportunity, for example, for a Title I school, if there's some pieces that need to be highlighted? Because I don't want to see that this is something huge that has to go out to parents, but I also know that every parent is not going to necessarily be able to go on a website and pull out sections of the plan.
Absolutely.
Either. So what's the thought around how that's going to be developed and be available?
Sure. So thank you for that question and feedback. And you're spot on. There are a lot of requirements, and especially in terms of for our Title I schools. They have the school home school compact, the Title I parent and family engagement plan. Many of those schools are community schools. They have work around partnerships. And what we've heard from families again is that, how do I access all of this? How do I know what my rights and responsibilities are? And so it's taking all of those documents and doing exactly what you just said and putting them in one place. So beyond the website, Title I schools have a requirement to broadly distribute information as it's described in the regulations with all of their families. And through the Title I parent and family engagement allocation that schools can use to support and lift up family and community engagement, they can access resources to be able to help with that in terms of printing that document, making it accessible via app, via school level apps. Many of our schools are already using platforms like Class Dojo and platforms like that to share information with families. It will also be translated. So those are some of the things that are already requirements that supports the fulfillment of federal and state guidelines for parent and family engagement. So I just wanted to answer that. We are also working on a graphic to be able to share how all of these different pieces talk to each other and what they mean, so that it's in one place. And that is something that we expect to be able to vet with the board and the community and families to see if this explains everything and does this make sense and how you access it in a centralized place.
And Jess, I just want to add, our plans are in so many different places, right?
Yes.
The community schools plan, this plan. And so families can't access it now because there's so many different places of getting it. So we want it in one place. And Jess, am I understanding this? Maybe you already said it, I missed it. It's also linked to the school performance plan, right? It's actually the improvement plan.
Yes.
It'll be dropped into the school improvement plan. So that's also a place where it will sit as part of the family engagement portion of that plan.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And again, I guess my concern is, the ability that we're going to have as staff and supports to help parents maneuver that. It is confusing for those who even write some of these plans to be able to navigate them. So that's just the concern I have. It sounds great, but it's really big. And to the extent that folks can understand that, that means that staff is really going to have to be very agile in terms of pulling out the correct places and resources and things for folks. But it's a great idea. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take that into consideration in revising the regulations and getting feedback from families and partners about that. Thank you.
Great. Commissioner James, did you have another question?
I did. Thank you so much. I'm wondering about under the policy standards in Roman numeral 3, letter G, where it says, city schools will allocate necessary resources to replace ineffective school, family, and community partnerships. what are the carrots and the sticks in this policy at the ground level? For example, one of the things that's come to the board, not super often because it doesn't happen super often, is in the replacement of a principal. And we'll hear, like, we didn't have a school family partnership until the day interviews had to happen. So what's sort of the year-long calendar that a community, family school community organization needs to be in place, those sort of milestones, and what does it mean to replace an ineffective family school community partnership?
Tina, I can take a step. So you mentioned a few, thank you so much. You mentioned a few things. You mentioned principal selection. I will call out that that work is being done in partnership with the School Family Council work group. Some of what you just mentioned has bubbled up to us already. And so if the effective practices are already in place, if the capacity building has taken place, you're more likely to have robust engagement and authentic established school family partnerships already happening in a school, so that when it comes time for that council to be engaged around principal selection, it is authentic, it's already there. So this policy is kind of like laying the foundation and framework for what that should look like. It has to start with capacity building. Part of what you mentioned with principal selection is also being done in partnership with human capital. They sit on the School Family Council work group and are working closely with us to revise those regulations to make sure that all stakeholders and staff have voice at the school level and are regularly engaged. You mentioned a calendar. One of the things that you'll see in the regulations to come, and particularly the School Family Council guidance that we're working to redraft, is to make sure that there's a year-long calendar. That is already a requirement in our school family councils, that schools should be communicating those monthly meetings and opportunities to be engaged and have their capacity built. But we need to make sure that that's stronger, and our school family council chairs and family and community engagement points of contact in schools are trained in how to do that. So I'll pause there to see if that kind of like answers the question for the first two pieces.
That was great, Ms. Lawrence. And I really appreciate earlier when Chief High Hubbard mentioned the budget meeting and making that at least twice a year. Another suggestion that I would have for your rubric of evaluating the quality of school family councils is the crosswalk of other policies. So for example, every school should have a wellness committee. If that could be housed as the responsibility of the school family council to make sure is in place. And then a question is there a requirement for a community member who does not have a student in schools to be representative on the school family council? So a business owner or a local retired community member.
Yes, that is we define community partner or member in the policy. It could be an individual. It could be, this came up, it could be the grandmother that lives across the street from the school. She's been a pillar in the community. She has a right to be part of the school family council and engage because of her proximity to that schoolhouse. So yes, individuals, businesses, grassroots organizations, neighborhood leaders, supporters
pastors,
of the school,
faith-based partners.
Absolutely, faith-based. They should be engaged broadly in the work for decision making at the school level. Absolutely.
Perfect. And then my last question is actually in regards to a policy update we had last week, which is on policy KCB on volunteer. So it seems like there may be something around volunteerism that could be more robustly connected through the school family council as a way of reporting. What does volunteerism look like at the school level?
Okay, that's great feedback. Thank you.
And so that's where I am. And thank you for all this work. This has been a long journey, and you all are doing just a spectacular job.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the feedback.
Great. And so we won't keep you too much longer. I just have a few questions and a couple of comments. And so I think more on the technical side of things, at the highest level, we talk about sort of, interactions. Is there a way for us to sort of sort of conceptualize that to be able to differentiate what is like the intensity or the degree of that interaction and the quality, right? And so how do we know it's a quality interaction between the community the council versus with a community member, and wondering if there's any thought went into sort of how do we sort of anchor it in quality interactions, partly because we know that there are ways in which we can do interaction work and still have people feeling marginalized, left out, unsupported through, which ultimately cuts, X's out the two-way communication street, right? And so just would love to hear like how you all are thinking about sort of quality interactions.
I would just say, and anyone else on the team can add, but I would start with one of the ways that we've been able to do that is through our family listening tours. And that is really getting down and really hearing from families. What was the engagement experience like? Do you really feel like your voice was heard? Were you able to see your hopes and dreams and needs reflected in school planning and school-wide planning and decisions? And in those one-to-one interviews and conversations with families, we're able to find out what that looks like on a smaller scale. I will also add to that by sharing one of the things that you'll see, you don't see it here, but we're thinking about how do we regularly assess stakeholder experience in our school, family, and community councils, and making sure that that is part of the system and structure of how we do decision-making in schools, so that we're regularly hearing from stakeholders. Tina, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, because I think we focused a lot on the school family community councils, but the whole goal of our policy is actually to create the dual capacity framework, right? Where we are having whole schools be responsible for engaging their parents, the community broadly. So the accountability factor, Commissioner Brooks, to your point around what's the quality of relationship or interaction between teachers and families, right? And the school and families, right? Is also equally as important as it is with the school family community council. And so we have just revised our family community survey for the year. Jessica's also been leading that work. Thank you, Jessica, with OAA, Chris Wan, to really revise the way in which we ask families questions about their experience, right? So we have a mid-year survey that's actually out right now through a partnership with Panorama. It's out right now for families to please, if anyone's listening, please take the survey, let us know how you're feeling. But in that we say, talk to us about the quality of interaction with your child's teacher. Do you feel like you get enough information from your school? Do you have what you need for your child to be successful, right? That's carrying over into the annual family survey as a way for us to judge not only the sort of school family council or community council, but also what's the school doing to really engage its families in the academic success of their children? That is the goal for our entire department. I say it over and over and over, but we are really wanting to also not only make that a goal, but then provide PD and support to schools to be able to do that work effectively. And we're actually piloting something really great with some intensive learning right now with Hewlett right now that we've got some external funding for. We're piloting a fantastic program to really do intense training with school-based teams around school family engagement, but then also measuring that and holding schools accountable, frankly, that Jess also put in our budget this year, thank you, Jess, that we're going to provide additional support to Title I schools to disaggregate their data and look at that data and say, what does this tell you about what families are experiencing? And how do you then pivot on that and use the data to actually create your plans that are going to be more thoughtful and more engaging with families? So we're actually holding folks more accountable, but also providing that underlayer of support. And we have now our school family specialists, that are going to be assigned to every CLN to provide that CLN with that coaching and that support, along with the additional support from Panorama to provide that data coaching. It was a longer answer than you asked for, but I think it's important to share. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think as you named, Chief, and you, Jessica, one of the things that I believe to be true. So you talked a lot about the capacity building and that being critical. So when I'm thinking about policy, are there dimensions of sort of what you name that might need to live in here so it can better sort of structure or guide the way in which people that capacity gets actually built so that it's a roadmap for folks? And so that's kind of what the spirit of the question, because I think I know that there's so much going on in that piece that, for policy, I'm feeling like, okay, so how do we roll this out so that when people read it, they know what to expect, what to get, how to get to it, and then also know what to sort of, expect from both the capacity building that you're offering, but then also that they feel, just like you said, disaggregating data is sort of a core essential piece of that's something that they could sort of even imagine and dream for, or aspire to. So that's kind of one of the things that kind of was rolling around in my brain.
And I really appreciate that. I just will say, in true transparency, that we actually have the dual capacity framework in the first draft of the policy.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that's what I've decided to do with my team, right? That's our thing. It's Karen Mapp's work. It's out of Harvard. It's like what we've picked as our strategy. But we didn't want to put that strategy title in the policy because I'm not going to be here for 20 years from now, right? So who knows but we did put it in the regs. But I think to Commissioner Brooks' point, Jessica, we kind of lost the feel of that capacity building when we took that language out. So how can we insert capacity building language into the policy? Well, there's a commitment, because I think that's always going to be a commitment to build staff capacity to do family engagement without calling it the dual capacity framework. How can we weave that back in?
I think we can. Thank you for that. I think we can go deeper with that in the policy.
Yeah, thank you. And so I have another just high level thought was, when I was reading it, there was a list, it was in the policy, there were a list of potential topics that the family councils could sort of rise to the occasion to sort of be considering in terms of whether it's budget or sort of principal hire, all of those things. I was wondering, where did you see sort of culture, like school culture and climate, in addition to sort of like student data, but like where does that sort of fit in sort of the way in which you might think about that? And if so, like, should we consider like having, I'm wondering if schools are pulling, data, maybe the council is also thinking about climate and culture stuff as well. And sort of what does that mean for them as a school?
Jess, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I feel like traditionally, as part of the SPP development process and all of that work, that school family council should be kind of like that anchor and guide for schools. I feel like that information was in the old policy, but in the regulations, that is captured in the school family council regulations as business of school family councils. That exists already. So when you get the updated regulations, that information will be there. We do need to engage the student wholeness team in that work and some other folks. And once we get closer, we'll bring them in to help us figure out what that looks like for that topic. But that is part of the existing work of council. So yes, you're spot on. You just wouldn't see it here.
Okay, great. And I think, let me see, do I have one more? So I was asking about that plan that Chair Chinia talked about, capacity building. So I just have one question, one final question then, is about sort of structure. And so, and I might have missed this or just kind of overlooked it. Could you describe the structure in terms of who's responsible for ensuring that these family councils are actually up and running? Because I was like, well, is it the principal or is it a student principal?
It is ultimately the instructional leader. It's the principal that is responsible for that. Because it's connected to so many high stakes things that take place in a schoolhouse. And so the principal leads that in partnership with the school family council chair, that organized parent group, all of those stakeholders work together, but ultimately it is the principal. And that is done through the support of a family and community engagement specialist that's assigned, as Tina mentioned, that CLN, they're assigned to schools to support them with making sure that they're implementing the policy with fidelity and getting the support that they need in areas that they need to scale in terms of what this all looks like. So yes.
Great.
And I would just add to that quickly, I'm sorry, Commissioner Brooks, but just that we also have through Title I allocation, a family and community engagement liaison that is in all of our Title I schools. And that liaison is not accountable, but is responsible for helping them design the strategy, bring in other staff members, et cetera. And every single Title I school of ours has a family and community engagement liaison on staff that gets a stipend from our office to implement these strategies.
Great. And so I was wondering then, sort of, is there, do we need to have language in there about sort of like, sort of, it's like the principal's responsibility then could be delegated or supported by, these particular people to kind of
that
like
exists in the regulations, the existing regulations that we're in the process of drafting. So yes, yes, okay. That information is in the budget guidance, all of that. But yes, we could mention it here. Absolutely.
Great. So well, that's the last question for me. I see Commissioner James' hand, and then after that question, we'll wrap up.
May I just add, Commissioner, that's also a part of the accountability and evaluation in the principal's evaluation process also. So I just to keep that train of thought, I just wanted to make certain that was known.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brooks. Just one wordsmith thing. Throughout the policy, there's often language of every student. The board is working towards each student just to give more accountability down to the granular level.
Okay.
But then my bigger question is under policy standards 3, letter F on the climate survey. So this sounds as if we're going to use a new climate survey. And we know that we've had climate surveys in the past. They're part of the charter renewal process. How is this? Are we doing a new survey? Are we aligning the old survey? How is this going to make sure that we're not constantly saying every year it's a new data set that can't be compared to prior data sets? And how are we going to make sure that the school climate survey has actually saturation of response? Any ideas on that?
I can start, and Jess, back me up if you can. So a couple things. One, the state requires us to use their staff survey, and the state requires us to use their student survey. But the family survey is something we developed. It's been the same survey actually for several years. We've made small tweaks to it, but it's been the same survey. But it doesn't get us to the place where we really know family experience. And so we've actually, Jessica has worked with ONI to talk through how this, and OAA, excuse me, how this actually works through with renewal to make sure we're asking the right questions so that it supports the charter renewal process as well as gives us data on individual schools. But we expect this new draft of the survey will be around for quite some time. It's not going to be that it's changing every year. This year's survey might have just a couple of tweaks in it because of the COVID pandemic, and that will be taken out in years to come. But we were trying to keep the meat of the survey or the standardization of the survey consistent for several years from now.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you all so much for this incredible work. Really, really beautiful seeing this sort of come to life. And so glad that Chief, you are leading the charge to make sure that families feel connected to the schools and to their young people. And so that's really, really encouraging and inspiring. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I just say one last thing? And that is that our last policy was stood up across the country as being a fantastic policy. I just want to say that. And other districts will come and look at our policy. And now we're making it better. Right. So we're taking that old one. It was a good policy, but we're making it even better. So thank you for that. We appreciate that. We appreciate all the feedback, and we'll go back and do some work on it before even we come to the board meeting with a presentation.
Yes, and thank you, Jessica, for all the work as well. So
thank
the whole team.
So much. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Bye.
And so up next we have some discussion about the travel policy, the district staff travel policy. And so we're going to hand over the mic to those folks.
All right. Good day. Can everyone hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
All right. Let me attempt to share my screen.
Commissioner Brooks, while he's sharing his screen, the policy itself is not available for us to review, nor the regulations, correct?
Correct. So this is this is the team requested some additional time. So this is going to be just more of a discussion to sort of better inform the policy development.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. And I was going to touch on that a little bit, but that's perfect introduction. So this is an example really of one of our processes working well in that we took this to the policy review team, which is relatively new, prior to bringing to policy committee. And just some etymology on this, like the district staff travel policy and reimbursement, it's something that doesn't exist in policy, obviously, but has existed as guidance and regulation that we've been using for a number of years now. So as a district, we have a few disparate pieces of information that say this is what you do in terms of travel reimbursements, this is what you do for food, et cetera. This is the forms that you submit, et cetera. So we're actually putting this into one place, and we thought it would be more useful for staff if they had somewhere where it was referenceable, somewhere where it's sort of like united all in one place, and something that folks have an ability to go through and check before they start submitting stuff or they even start thinking about travel. So the thinking here and the work that was done here was to pull those bits and pieces together, to refine them, update them. Some of them are relatively are pretty old. Like the example I use is that we had one line where it was referencing like use of MapQuest for tracking mileage, and I don't know when's the last time any of you saw MapQuest on anything or for anything. Updating some of the language, some of the forms, and we have systems already in place for doing some of these things. Like the e-forms are already in the system in Oracle, they're add-ons. The places that you go to submit for your reimbursements already exist. And we're also sort of bearing in mind the fact that we are at the entry point or the beginning of evaluating ERP vendors and looking into changing our ERP system. And this is one of the modules theoretically that would be included in a new system. And we've seen already some interesting ways that some of the software, modern software, can incorporate travel reimbursement and reimbursement just in general into the software in terms of ease of use and access to staff and so forth. So we were mindful of that, and that there's going to be some update within the next 2 years on that, but we didn't want to wait that period of time and leave the ambiguity that currently existed with regards to travel policies and reimbursements. So that was the work we begun, and as I was saying, part of the system working well was that we took this to the policy review team and got a lot of feedback, some of which we didn't anticipate, on what we put together. And we thought, we kind of had two different avenues in terms of like proceeding with what we have now, or kind of going back to the drawing board and taking a more holistic approach, at least figuring out how in the interim, the next year or two, which is still a relatively long period of time, we can make this be more than what it is and still sort of like check all the boxes and goals. When you talk about reimbursement and travel policies, it's sort of like two overarching tenets. Number one, and I think this one usually goes without saying, but I'll still say it, is to make sure that we're all staying out of trouble, right? It's to make sure that something that is highly visible, like reimbursement and staff spending, is done in a manner where it's all above board. And it's not just a matter of it being above board, it's also a matter of it not being anywhere near the line that it can be misinterpreted, right? So it's not just impropriety, but the appearance of impropriety, if you've heard that before. So we want to make sure that things are done in such a way where it's not even questionable. The other tenet, of course, is and this is, I'm going to call out, Chief Doherty a little bit. One of the things that he's highlighted since he's been here in the last year is that we as a finance office are not just an office based in operations, but also an office based in customer service. So how staff experience, our policies and processes has also become more important to us, and getting feedback on that and making sure that things are done in a way that sort of creates ease of use. Now, the contradiction, of course, with something like a reimbursement policy is that you don't want it too easy to use. You don't want it exploitable necessarily, but you want it to be accurate, you want it to be clear, you want it to be concise. So those are the sort of balances that we were going for. So what we have here is the initial thinking and presentation that was done and presented to the policy review team that we received some feedback on. There are a couple of tweaks in here, and at the end of this, what we're going to talk about is some of the thinking going forward in terms of how we plan to adjust or sort of pivot this, and some of the things that we want to look at in terms of timing, as we go along. So with all that context, here is the relatively, updatable presentation. So the first thing we talk about is business travel. So defining what that means. conference on local travel, giving parameters in terms of distance, what's considered local versus what's considered out of town, you know, and based on what the source location is, which is North Avenue. The next section, we talk about the approval and authorization. So the time period of which we need to get pre-approval for travel request forms, and also when they can be resubmitted. We included a few samples of some of the forms. Like I said, these are already in the system right now. The travel request form is an add-on on eForm, so it bolts onto Oracle. So it's able to pull some of your employee information. And it also is able to route through the various approval queues. So once staff submit with the dollar amounts and the justifications and descriptions, it'll go to the appropriate supervisor and so forth. Same for the local travel reimbursement forms, which come to accounting for payment. So these exist in eForms as well. So like I said, these are things that are currently in place and have already been in place, but these are things that, you know, we very much look forward to being able to update under the new ERP system. We've seen examples of where, you know, a lot of these things can be done from your own personal cell phone. You can access the system and snap pictures of receipts and so forth. Something that our 20-year-old system is not necessarily adept at being able to figure out right now, but that we very much look forward to. But there are current forms in place for submitting for reimbursements, and these are some samples from those. So this goes into a little more detail on the employee expense reimbursement form. And we would detail, you know, exactly how long you have to fill it in and turn it in and get a turnaround time, what should be included, what attachments should be included, and how long within the end of the trip, 30 days that you need to submit this form as well for reimbursement. And part of the timing, just to touch on that one point, the timing for reimbursement is one of those examples where it's like there's a balance, or you have to find a balance between accountability, auditability, and also employee use or ease of use. You'd like to be able to say, hey, just submit it anytime, whenever you get back. But of course, we have accounting periods. We want to make sure, for example, if a form is submitted, that the dollars are accounted for in the correct fiscal year. These dollars, just like everything else in city schools, we have to make prioritization decisions for these dollars. So dollars that offices or schools spend for travel reimbursements are dollars that cannot be spent on other things and other items. And those dollars all fall within our regular fiscal year parameters, general fund parameters, just like we would for anything else. I think the point that these funds can have other uses is also an important one in terms of balancing how offices and schools utilize reimbursements, and so that's part of this policy, as well as just making sure that folks are aware of what can be reimbursed, what can't be reimbursed. So also when they're doing the upfront planning and budgeting, they can account for these things as much as possible, and instead of making them last minute changes or expenses. The next item or next slide here is some of the expense reimbursement guidances. So transportation and lodging. The $199 rate, which you see here, is something that we'll touch on one of the later slides that we did receive feedback on. This is a relatively, long established, I want to say 6-7-year-old number. We know that rates for lodging have changed and can change. One of the adjustments that have been made is that we use the GSA approved rate. So that allows us to take rates based on the location. So, California, for example, may have different rates from Baltimore or New York, depending on where the conferences are being held. We also received some feedback in terms of using rates from the provider. If it's being held at a specific location and they have a hotel that's allocated for that location and they have a set rate for attendees, being able to have the flexibility to do that. So that's another thing that we're looking at in terms of making adjustments or how that can be accounted for. Expense reimbursement guidelines. So it's a continuation. This covers meals and mileage. If you see that last bullet point, that's the one I was mentioning where it said MapQuest, and we updated to say Google Maps because no one even knows what MapQuest is anymore. But again, referencing GSA for meals and the tiers associated with those and reimbursements, as well as what falls under mileage, and also setting limits on mileage. One of the things that you want to be able to, I guess, keep in check is whether or not folks are I don't want to say driving for driving's sake, but if there are things that could be done more efficiently by air travel or train, or as opposed to just driving cross country, and just, I'm going to bill for the mileage, so I'll just, drive for 500 miles. You want to be able to keep things like that in check. So there's sort of like a cost benefit analysis to, the choices that are being made when you go through the process. Next slide covers phone calls, public transportation, and tolls. Again, just giving some more specificity in terms of the expense reimbursement guidelines for those items. On this slide, we actually did some reaching out to neighboring jurisdictions and checking on their policies to see some of what's included and see some of the similarities between theirs and ours. There's very little in terms of variance. One of the things that did stand out, if you notice, like Harford County has commute reimbursement, not something that I think necessarily we would look to implement on our end, but something like that essentially reimburses staff for travel to and from work, which could be problematic depending on how it's implemented as well. But other than that, everything seemed to align fairly well with what we do. There are some variances in terms of the application of a per diem, which is something that we'll discuss a little bit on the last slide as well. So this is, like we said, we presented at that policy review team, and some of the items that came up for feedback I touched on already, like the 199 rate and GSA rate, the nightly conference rate. Also looking at how we can vary this, or if there should be any variety in the policy depending on employment type, whether you are contractual versus temp versus long-term employee or so forth. And creating a route for reimbursement appeals. So if you are in an instance where you submit for reimbursement, that reimbursement is denied, having a clear-cut route for how you'd go about submitting an appeal for that reimbursement, who reviews it, and so forth. And some of the piggybacks from that then are, some of them can be fairly dramatic. So there is a version of this where we create a flat per diem. We no longer do, hotel, airfare, et cetera. It's just one flat per day fee that's reimbursed that can cover different things. Part of the research I'll need to go along with an approach like that is how we audit that, how we track that. A lot of the things that we have to do in terms of requirements for our own reporting, financial reporting, need to be very clear, and it's creating a new reporting model and audit model for a lot of those things, different from what we've done in the past, different from what our auditors have experienced with us and felt comfortable with and given us feedback on. So that's something we'd want to broach with folks who have done it or have done a different model, also with auditors in terms of what what sort of questions they may ask about it, or what sort of supplemental materials they may want to see to back up something like that. So those those sort of changes could be relatively more complicated than just saying, hey, we just want to make this update to the policy and everyone likes it and thinks it's a good idea. But ultimately, how does it affect our final audit questions and audit standings is going to be pretty important. So we looked at a number of these things. One of the other points that was brought up, and I think one of the best points from the policy review team, was a question around equity. There were specific examples of staff participation or lack thereof in professional development of different items because of the need to upfront, pay for certain items. Hotels aren't necessarily usually, there are circumstances, aren't necessarily usually as much of a barrier. Sometimes they just require a hold. They may put $100 hold or whatever the case is instead of charging the full amount until afterwards. And there are instances where they allow you to pay by check instead of credit card charges. But one of the biggest hindrances is usually airfare, travel that has to be paid up front, or in the fact that, staff may not have the money necessary to put up, to do some of these professional developments or travel, even though they're going to get the money back. But sometimes the cost, for an event between airfare, hotel, travel, et cetera, it could be pretty expensive. You're looking at, $1,000, $2,000, sometimes, depending on how many people and whatever the case is. So because of that, we did receive specific feedback and examples that, there were a lot of folks who just did not attend or didn't even, try to do professional development, who were being kind of cut out of the opportunity for professional development because of those financial barriers. And that really struck us as an equity issue in terms of how and something that, initially we felt outside of the scope of the policy, but in thinking through it, we thought was necessary to address in terms of a policy like this. If we want to have something that's sort of, unifying how staff experience travel, reimbursements, and all the rest of that across the district, it seemed like the appropriate place, to deal with that sort of equity issue as well. There are things that we've already started to brainstorm and research with regards to ways that we can work around that. But what we're essentially going to be looking for is, the time to sort of put those things to the test and review those things and get more feedback on those things. And feedback has to be a little more varied than some of our usual channels. It's not just, sort of like asking principals or staff members how they feel about certain things. We kind of have to look towards a few other professional resources as well, and organizations, and like I mentioned, auditors and so forth, to sort of kind of get a better feel for any loopholes that could be, found in a policy like this when we go through the process of updating it and changing it the way that we intend to. So that being said, this is where we are right now and what we presented. If you have additional thoughts, things that we should be adding to the list for consideration and thinking as well, we'd be happy to hear those, particularly now, like I said, as we're looking at how we can sort of, make larger changes to the policy than what we had initially, thought through.
Courtney?
Yes, sir.
I wanted to add something, and not to stave off any commissioner or other comments, but one thing that I wanted to add, and I don't think it's an omission in your overview, but it's the ERP aspect, right? And so it wasn't an omission that Courtney didn't mention the ERP, the Enterprise Resource Planning, gigantic system-wide software system that we're in the middle of putting out, looking for a new one, right? And the one we have is about 20 years old, and naturally finance and payroll and reimbursements would be one of the many functions that falls under ERP. So even while we're trying to improve the travel policy, there's a travel policy, but I think for a lot of folks, and maybe that's just the finance, we think of it as a reimbursement policy, right? In other words, people want to get reimbursed. There's other things that go into a travel policy, but we're looking at this as Courtney laid out. How do we improve getting the funds to people and making it smooth and making travel not kind of an onerous thing, but kind of smooth? And so we didn't want to say, oh, we're going to sort that out in the ERP, because that's not going to happen quickly enough for you or for us. At the same time, we are really kind of falling in love with and impressed by certain whiz-bang aspects of certain new ERPs. We want to get to a place where the ERP system will help us get to a better place, right? But if we were afraid that if we mentioned too much about the ERP, it would be like, wait, you're not going to wait 18 months or 2 years to improve this, are you? And the answer to that is no. We're going to make improvements shorter than that. At the same time, we're going to try to incorporate it into our new ERP, which we have high hopes for, because it's the new shiny thing that we hope is a lot better in a whole lot of ways for a whole lot of people than what we have now, which is 20 years old. And just to echo what Courtney said, because it was a real eye opener, and I think when we heard from our colleagues in the policy committee, we were expecting certain types of feedback about the reimbursement portion of the travel policy. What I felt like was the gut punch was what Courtney laid out there. The idea that one of our colleagues or some of our colleagues would not undertake professional development because they didn't want to deal with the hassle and then the time lag in getting reimbursed, that was a real sucker punch. That was a whopper, and that one really landed. And we want to build this new improvement to just try to take that away from happening, and do the things that Courtney outlined, which is to say front load whatever we can, get things in place as much as possible, so that someone doesn't have to factor that in. They factor in all the other stuff. Does it help me do my job? Can I take the time off? Can I work it in with my life? But not also adding in, can I wait 2 months to get reimbursed for $750 or $230 or whatever it may be? We want to remove that from the calculus. And that was not one we went into the policy committee meeting having anticipated. So that is the system working, if you will, of opening our eyes to even bigger things than, you know, double-sided receipt copying or something that we went in there focused on.
Great, thank you so much for that. Yeah, you know, I'm deeply excited that the internal sort of like policy review team sort of flagged that for folks. And I'll share some of my thoughts, but just wanted to open the floor to some of the other commissioners who have thoughts about this policy and, or rather this thinking, this pre-thought and sort of revamping of our travel policy.
I can go ahead if that works for you.
Yep.
So just to be clear, this is centrally allocated professional development travel, or is this also at the school-based budget? And if so, how does that intersect with school activity funds and our just general fiscal audit vulnerabilities as a whole?
So it is both. It's both central and schools. Schools allocate individually for their reimbursements, whether it's mileage reimbursements or other items, or local, whatever the case is. So that's why I mentioned, there is a serious juxtaposition between like how resources get allocated for things like this versus how they get allocated for educational elements, because this all comes out of the general fund dollars that schools have available. And even in central office, in terms of how you staff positions versus, what you spend on reimbursements. So it is both schools and central, and there is definitely vulnerability in how those dollars are allocated if we're not tracking it and pre-approving as much of it as possible. So that's why we do ask for copies of all the receipts. That's why we have to physically manually check to make sure there isn't like alcohol on a receipt when it's submitted, or things like that. There are a lot of different areas where it does require some manual interference or checking or just to make sure that we're sort of adhering to the standards. And part of that is why we wanted to bring this up to begin with. No one asked us like, hey, where's the travel policy? It was kind of like our suggestion that we make it a policy because I think there was a little too much variability in terms of like how folks went about the process and not finding out what they needed to do until it got to us, necessarily for approval. So that having it as a policy up front, kind of eliminates some of that discrepancy. So that there are some vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. Having it as a policy, it helps to address some of those, but also making sure that we're doing so in a way that I guess is not overly restrictive and can still allow the level of participation, necessary that the district would like to have.
Thank you for that. My last question then, Mr. Chair, would be simply that when we do a compliance report on this policy or an update to the board, if you could geographically map where those dollars are going to which schools around the district to make sure that it is not just those that are more enfranchised that are able to access. So mapping it by school, mapping it by content area to make sure that we're distributing professional development funds equally to content, proportionally, not equally, proportionally to content areas, and also to staff level, whether that's PSRP, principals, teachers, making sure that this isn't a policy that uplifts those who already have access to encourage more professional development, but rather is truly saturating our district from every aspect of spaces where folks interact with students and buildings and facilities to make sure we're getting the most robust learning for our folks possible.
Yeah, we can do that. And to be clear, the dollars are not allocated centrally or by us in finance necessarily for reimbursement. So a school like me as principal A in my school budget can make the determination that I'm setting aside X amount of dollars, or that I'm not setting aside dollars for reimbursement because I don't have the funds, available to do so. So it comes down to an individual cost center. A chief or a director can make that determination under, if the director of procurement says, we need to do this travel for ASBO conference or whatever this year, or my procurement folks need to be up to date on whatever, guidance needs to be done. they can make the determination with their own individual budget. We can absolutely report on what has been done, but it's not like a central pot of planning dollars that goes out for PD.
Right. And Courtney, that's exactly why I would say that it's important for us to map it out locally, because a school that has to spend their entire general budget on providing shoes for students doesn't have any money left for professional development. Yet those faculty and staff deserve every aspect of professional learning possible. So when we look at how we do equity-based budgeting, just because this school didn't have resources to allocate to professional development doesn't mean that that should be a double down negative consequence for that school. But perhaps we need to look centrally then at how we allocate professional development funds in addition to the general revenue to that school to be able to equalize the opportunity for professional excellence across our campuses.
Understood. Yeah.
And
Thank
Commissioner James, just a quick question for you, a clarification.
Sure.
So do we have a sort of a professional development policy? Because I heard sort of like the travel piece that sort of this is sort of bringing in here, which is, you know, some entities have a specific policy around who gets professional development, how often they get it, how much is allocated to that. So I just didn't know if we had that, given that you've been in the district running the policy.
Yeah, to my knowledge, we have a few policies that require professional development components, like the opioid addiction has a certain policy compliance. There's some cleanliness, like chemical issue, as far as like who uses bleach, things like that. I don't know that we have an overarching professional development or professional learning policy for faculty and staff, and that may be something as chair that you want to put on the agenda for next year.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, because I was wondering,
Absolutely.
I was like, okay, those might be interesting points so that we can get at some of the things that you were just naming specifically. Chair Cheney, I saw that you come off the screen. Did you want to go? You wanted to say something before I went to Commissioner McFadden?
You go to Commissioner McFadden, and then I'll come on. I just wanted to reply to the last one, and I believe there's a component of professional development that's within human capital, but I don't. But since the system no longer has as it used to at one time have a central professional development department, it probably that activity moved to be more site-based. So, to your answer. So it's probably something to look into for some experiences, but that's what has happened. But that's all I wanted to say. But I don't have another question. All right.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. Commissioner McFadden?
And I know that in a lot of the policies that are drafted, at least recently, there is a professional learning and development aspect attached to all of them. So I'm not sure if having an overarching policy would, I don't know what the goal would be for that. If it would be redundant, maybe I'm thinking, if there are already professional learning and development standards within specific policies, do we need an overarching? It's just something that came to mind when you mentioned that.
Yeah, no. I brought it up because I know that that's how sort of organization sort of like, so if you're marketing to a new hire, right? So you're saying like you have $2,000 of professional development money, for you to do X, right? So I'm just thinking about it in the context of whether it's in the sort of the government space or the nonprofit space. And so, then sort of underneath that was like, are there places that have been funds have not been allocated to do professional development because we just have multiple functions and very large scale. So my thinking around the question was about, do we have a broader professional development policy to ensure that we're making staff at every single level having access to professional development, not just those who sort of rise to the top. And so that's sort of, when I'm thinking about equity, that's sort of what comes to my mind. Who doesn't actually get to take advantage of those resources because they don't know that they have them, or there's no funds allocated to that specific area at that time, but we should be thinking about, okay, so we know there needs to be more learning and development, professional development money over here. What strategies are we taking to actually get there? So those are sort of some of my thinking around sort of why we would have a broader professional development policy, not necessarily just have it live in intersection, like independent pieces. And maybe it's coordinating it all. So yeah, so it was just a thought to me as Commissioner James was talking that I'll definitely look into a little bit further to figure out. Are there other thoughts in terms of equity or this particular lens for this this topic of travel?
I think it's great, Courtney, that you mentioned, you know, the reimbursement. I know that there have been several staff members within city schools that have had to come out of pocket for, you know, travel or professional learning opportunities that were not offered here in the district. And to your point, it was a burden for some. Some were able to just front the cost, and then some were not able to. So I appreciate the review committee and you all working through that. I think it will be great to see whenever it does come to us and draft the policy, how you all navigate through that, because I think that that's right. If there are professional learning or development opportunities that are not provided by the district, or if there are conventions or conferences based on association that folks need to travel to, they can't go unless they can pay for it and then get the money back. So I just appreciate the thinking around that. And I look forward to seeing how that takes shape prior to the first reader draft.
Yeah, and you know, for me, it was really, really important, you know, as a young professional making a few dollars and then folks wanting me to front $2,000, $3,000 for a conference and have to put it on a credit card, but then I don't get reimbursed in that same 30-day window. So, you know, that could impact my credit as well, right? So there's some real material impacts for sort of upfronting money and then having a really long turnaround time at the district to get reimbursement. So, you know, so I'm really, really happy that sort of that landed for folks and that you all are going to spend some additional time on that. And I guess from just, you know, from my perspective, you know, as you all are sort of going through sort of the work, there are ways in which I love the flexibility around sort of like maybe depending on the hotel that we're staying at, we're using their room rate. Because one of my immediate questions was I saw that $199 rate and I was just thinking like, oh, well, that won't fly in New York because New York is $300 a night. And then sort of if you go to a space where that $199 is work, so will people have the option to say, well, that $199 rate is whatever that static rate is. I want a room that's a little bit better than that $199 rate. So would they be able to split the difference? So would a $199 cover that, and then they would just pay the difference on top of that, for example? That's my mind went to a very technical piece around that.
No, that's a very good question, and that is absolutely the case, and that is what we tell staff right now. For example, I once went to a conference, probably 2 years ago, and the conference that we went to, it was in Texas, and it was hosted, you know, in that specific hotel. So the hotel, you know, has the rate, they have the rooms, they have everything else. The reimbursement rate, of course, is lower than you know the actual cost of the room per night. So I, out of my own pocket, pay the difference. You know, so I get reimbursed up to the reimbursement amount, and then I will pay the variance, you know, myself. So everyone does have that option. But like you pointed out, you know, locations vary. You know, Texas is one thing versus, you know, California versus New York. So that's why we use the GSA rate, because that it takes into account that geographic, you know, variance. You know, how some areas that cost more than others, DC. You know, so we use that rate to account for that difference. But there is definitely, you know, more thought that we want to put into that. And again, you know, I would not be, you know, myself and a finance person if I didn't, you know, reiterate, you know, that we do have to balance, you know, the ease of use with the actual availability of resources. You know, I understand we want to increase equitable access for everyone to professional development, but we're still in a circumstance where we don't have a lot of, you know, dollars floating around necessarily. So even in creating that opportunity, we want to make sure it's not done in such a way that it is too restrictive. You know, if Chief Doherty in building his budget for FY22 says, you know, I have to make the decision between, you know, continuing to carry copier costs for the district or sending my staff on professional development, you know, professional development, we want to be able to cut it out and say, you know, this is the decision we made and this is the prioritization decision that we had to make based on the resources that we had. So we just want to sort of like bear that in mind as we kind of like move forward with it. While we do want to increase the equitability of it, we also don't want to make it so restrictive that, you know, folks are forced to spend money or reserve dollars for things that they may deem a lower priority as opposed to other items, you know, when going through the budgeting decision process. I don't know if I expressed that, you know, properly, but I think you guys nodding, you follow what I'm.
Yes. So
Yeah.
I completely hear that, Courtney, and so one of the things that really resonates with me when you said that was, you know, sort of having to prioritize. And then my question, so that's really great information, because if the same people are having to prioritize these same things over and over at the expense of learning and development, that's information for us to say, is there a way for us to find another way forward? So, I think, you know, sort of the continual falling back we don't have or we can't do, knowing that professional development is a core and central function of who we are as a district. And it helps, you know, particularly when we think about academic professional development, you know, folks are having to prioritize like that. I think that's a flag for us to figure out how do we sort of strategically build out additional resources or streams as well. So it's all helpful and useful data points to sort of work through. Yeah. So, Chris, I see your hand, and then did you want to jump in or add anything to what Courtney had said?
I did, but I think I came to the queue after Board Chair Chinia, so I feel bad jumping the line.
Awesome, thank you. So we'll move over to Chair Chinia.
I just want to be certain, I'm sort of going back to Commissioner McFadden. I want to be certain that we aren't mixing all of this into becoming just professional development. I think the travel and reimbursement policy involves more than just professional development. There are occasions for work-related reasons that people need to travel, and clearly we need to have this. And I want to thank you for doing this, because there are times when you wonder what what the procedures were. So having this, I think, is great. And putting it together as sort of helping to make some decisions about what that new system might be that can then enhance it is good. But I don't want us to get caught into that all of this is just professional development. That is clearly another whole body of discussion, and I'm not disagreeing that might be a policy piece. We do have a principle as a system that we have continuous learning for everyone within the system. But that's really, I don't want this to get conflated here, because this is really a little bit different than just talking about professional development. So I just wanted to make certain we didn't get too far in there, because that may be another conversation and another set of issues to discuss at a different time.
I may have started that conflation train myself when I shared that the example that led to an epiphany in the policy review committee happened to be a professional development one. So I might have added to that. It made such an impact on Courtney and me. But when I raised my hand, it was to add to Commissioner Brooks that it was very similar. You're sharing some of your experiences. It was very much of a piece with the policy review committee, and it was interesting because it was also eye-opening in that, like you say, a young professional trying to do everything, kind of just everything we want, and then if they're put in a situation of having to front the money, there's an asymmetry between the individual and the organization that we're more and more aware of. And the asymmetry comes out in a couple of ways. One is that person, every person, they know when they shelled out that money. And that's when their clock starts ticking. And it's a very real clock. It's not an arbitrary thing. They don't say, well, I'd like to get paid within. They shelled out this money and they want to get paid as soon as possible, but in no case later than when their credit card, if they have one, payment is due. And whereas the finance office can think of it one, they come at it maybe from a net 30 world, and their clock starts when all the paperwork is in order, right? So they think, well, I've gotten everything, it's been submitted, looking good. You know, either implicitly or explicitly, they think I might have 30 days to deal with this and still, you know, get an A. And we're now better understanding that in many cases the two clocks were not aligned, and that it led to some folks, in the worst case example, maybe foregoing certain travel, which a subset of which could be professional development travel, rather than deal with the vagaries of getting reimbursed. And that was the big eye opener that we had, and that we want to reconcile. Another one that came up was whether, you know, folks who want to stay at the conference hotel, you know, if at all possible, they want to stay at the conference hotel where all the action is and where all the connections and synergies are happening and not across the city. So we want to make all these improvements. We'll probably still have times where we have to disagree with somebody's preferred first trip, but we want to make those rarer and fewer, and align the two clocks that we have. That was all I wanted to say, because it was very consistent with what the other group said, and we're really hearing that feedback from across the board.
Great, thank you. Commissioner James?
Thank you. So I just wanted to, in the name of non-conflating, just also as you go through these regulations, thinking about what about in-district travel for itinerant teachers? Does that fall under this? For itinerant staff, fall under this travel policy as far as mileage reimbursement? And do they need to get prior approval, or is their schedule just that approval? And then secondly, say testifying in Annapolis, prior approval, or is there a blanket, like if you want to drive, you can get reimbursed for that? Just to make sure that, as you know, Chair Cheney points out, that this is not just about professional development, but also then looking at where those dollars are allocated by school, by district, when we get that compliance report, to make sure that we're simply only not empowering some folks, but are really looking at this equitably.
Makes sense.
Great. And so I think my last thought is, in terms of sort of folks who, so that I think might be important to engage, again, those younger professional folks who are in the space. And as Commissioner James mentioned, like anybody who's going to be doing sort of any travel, sort of, even if it's locally, to be in the conversation about the context and sort of how do we design systems and processes to meet those needs. And I think that's sort of really, in terms of like engagement, sort of understanding people's context and working and meeting those contextual needs as to whatever degree possible at the district level. And so, do you all have a sense of who else you will be engaging in terms of community partners and stakeholders and things of that nature?
Not fully. We do want to make sure we're hearing from across the district, by which I mean not just central, not just schools, not just specific types of schools. So if we can pull from charters versus traditional versus schools with high EL populations and not, so just like a breakdown of different schools. But I think I mentioned this earlier, a lot of the feedback that I think we'll have to do will be external. So it'll be sort of like liaising with and seeing what sort of opinions we can get from our auditors or some auditing bodies, as well as what other districts are doing and what they have seen in terms of, or not just districts, jurisdictions, it could be, city entities, et cetera, what they're doing and what they've been seeing in terms of feedback and questions and then audits and so forth based on that as well. Like, some of these things may entail using different softwares than what we have right now, or different vendors. For example, like, we have vendors that do some of the pre-travel planning and so forth. So there are a couple of the angles that may be procurement related as well that we are still investigating. So there are a couple different, there are a few different legs to it, that may shake out differently depending on how, when you see this again next time. And inversely, there may be some more that, we kind of go through and we're like, what, this is just a bad idea to begin with. And we end up closer back to square one, but hopefully that's not the case. But I think there are some things too where we have to be careful of not going too overboard and then, getting ourselves in trouble. So.
Great. I'm so glad that you got your eye on that, Courtney.
We kind of live in that space. We like I said, it's not just impropriety; it's the appearance of impropriety. We try to stay, far enough to the side of that line that, we don't give cause for questions. So.
Awesome. So that's it for me in terms of questions. Do we have any other questions from any of the commissioners before we thank them for the presentation? Awesome. Well, Courtney, thank you so much again for this.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, super excited to see what this looks like when it comes back to us as well. And thank you, Chris, as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Brooks.
Thank you. Bye. And so, did we have any, Christian, I didn't think on the document, didn't look like we had any folks who signed up for public comment. Is that true?
No, we didn't.
Great. And so, I guess, let me check. So Commissioner James, did you sort of want to, I know we had like a few more minutes. Did you want to close this particular portion and just have some additional conversation, or what were you thinking?
No, it's all good. I just wanted you to know that there were students present so that if there was a few minutes afterwards, if they had any process questions or anything that you might want to answer off the record, that was an option. But if you don't want to do that, or you want to do that privately or let them email you, that I just wanted you to know they were here. That's all.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. So I'll ask the team. So do we want to take a few questions from the students? Because I know folks might have different agenda items, but I know we're scheduled to 5:30 anyway. So is it okay for Ronald and Chair Chinia, if that would be okay? Sweet. Great. So for the students, folks who joined us, did you have any questions for us?
Hi, Dr. Brooks, this is Shirley.
Hi.
Hi. I just have a question with regards to family and community engagement. What is the historical background of the policy? Is it based on a federal guideline?
Oh, that's beyond me. So we would need a staff member on the phone to do that, unless Chair Chinia, who's been here, could speak to that.
Since I think I'm other than the staff, I'm probably the person with the most experience. The focus was around federal guidelines, yes. And I think it was mentioned in the presentation, the different iterations of what is Title I, Chapter 1, whatever, always required some type of compact or plan for parent. It started off as parent involvement. It has evolved to community engagement. The system, I think, as Chief Highcover said earlier, a few years with the current policy, expanded that to all schools, and we're continuing. And I'm good. She's on board, so she can answer further. But
yes, ma'am.
I do believe it started with that original requirement from the federal.
Yeah, and if you look at the ESSA guidance from the federal government, it does require every school district to have a robust family community engagement plan that addresses how parents are to be connected to schools, what the rights are for parents. So one thing, for example, is that we are supposed to be helping communicate to families in their home language. And so we are taking it upon ourselves to make sure we have a robust translations plan as part of not only that, but our comms plan in general. So there are definitely ESSA guidelines, and we could actually share those, make sure that they're shared. Jessica left the meeting, but I can ask her to share them, and we can post them on our website so we can actually see them. But there is a link. If you just Google ESSA guidelines for education, you can actually see family and community engagement guidelines that are tied to the federal requirements.
And Chief Highcover, would you explain what ESSA is? I think that could be something necessary.
You want to help me explain it, sir?
No, it's the every student.
School. Thank you. I don't know.
Every student school achieves. It's something. It's very similar to.
I can jump in, Commissioner McFadden. It's the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act of the early 1970s, which guaranteed free public appropriate education beyond the special ed component to that, to every young person in the United States.
Thank you, Professor James Hassan.
Thank you so much. I think I'm gonna get an A or A plus.
That's right.
Thank you so much. And then I'm so grateful to be able to observe how you work, and thank you for all the work that you have done for the children of Baltimore City and for me as a teacher. So I am so grateful to be able to observe you work. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great. So were there any other questions before we close this meeting? Okay.
Commissioner Brooks, if there aren't any more students, I do think it is appropriate to recognize Dr. Dabrowski, Dr. Joan Dabrowski, who is on with us this afternoon, our Chief Academic Officer. I don't believe that she was in a meeting with us prior to this. So I just wanted to make sure we said good afternoon, good evening to you, and that we can now put a name to the face all of us that are here this afternoon.
Thank you so much. I've really appreciated listening in this afternoon. I've learned quite a bit. So thank you so much for the warm welcome.
Thank you. It's so nice to meet you. And welcome to the district.
Thank you.
Great. And so as soon as my computer stops freezing, Christian, my computer is frozen. Can you sort of close us out in terms of detailing the next meeting, and then the how folks can stay engaged and sign up for public comment?
Sure, give me one moment. So next, our next policy meeting is going to be on March 27th. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the agenda. March 16th, excuse me, which is the third Tuesday in the month from 3:30 to 5:30, and the topic will be GCLE telecommuting, which is very timely. As far as signing up for public comment, again, the 3 board public-facing committees are always available for public comment. That is Policy Committee, Teaching and Learning, and Operations. Signups are permitted starting on 9 a.m. the Thursday before the meeting until 5 p.m. the Monday before the meeting, which would have been yesterday. And again, since we're closed, you can give us a call at, the building is closed, you can give us a call at 443-984-2000 or email in the board office to sign up at schoolboard@bcps.k12.md.us. And also, just as one other announcement, we are now offering translation services for our board and committee meetings for public comment in our top 5 languages, which the district's top 5 languages, which are Spanish, French, Arabic, Swahili, and Tigringa.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Christian. So thank you everyone for coming and participating and sharing. Thank you all to our commissioners as well. So it is currently 5:21. I will close this meeting. And we look forward to seeing you at the next policy meeting. Thank you all again. All right, bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.